Hello there and welcome to Star Wars Comics in Canon, your guide to the wider Star Wars canon through the comic book lens. And to take you on this journey, I'm your host, Mike Burton. So in the fourth episode of Star Wars Comics in Canon, I wanted to delve into the Shattered Empire run of comics. It was a comic mini-series. Issue 1 came out September 2015. Issue 4, which is the final issue, came out in October 2015, and the hardcover edition came out September 2016. I'm mentioning the hardcover because if you tuned in last week to my episode about C-3PO's red arm, you'll know that the hardcover of the Shattered Empire comic also includes the one-shot C-3PO comic, which explains how he got his red arm. Now, Shattered Empire is part of the Journey to the Force Awakens. Essentially, I briefly mentioned it in the last episode, but every time since the new canon, Disney has released a new Star Wars film, they release a Journey to the blank line of books and comics. The Shattered Empire one was Journey to the Force Awakens. The C-3PO Red Arm comic was meant to be Journey to the Force Awakens, but because of multiple delays and things, it didn't get released until April of the following year. There are quite a few other things that were released. I think it's 19 stories in total that were released as the Journey to the Force Awakens, but a lot of them are sort of short stories or junior things. So I'd say that the Aftermath Trilogy, mainly the first Aftermath book by Chuck Wendig, that is a part of the Journey to the Force Awakens, and the Lost Stars novel by Claudia Gray is also a part of this. The writer for this comic is Greg Rucka. He has actually released a few other Star Wars content. He's released the book Guardian of the Whills, the book Smuggler's Run, A Han Solo and Chewbacca Adventure, which is also part of the Journey to the Force Awakens, but it's a junior novel, so I'm trying not to delve into the junior stuff too much, or I'll be here all day. And he also did the Grounded short story From a Certain Point of View. He's done loads of other works as well, so make sure you check him out. The colourist is Andres Mossa, and then there are actually 3 artists in this run of 4 comics, which is Marco Checchetto, Angel Unzueta, and Emilio Laiso. Now, this was also one of the first comics that came out since the new canon. I believe the only one that came out before this, that was a mini-series, was the Princess Leia series of comics. I am going to be delving into the Chewbacca, Lando, and Leia mini-series as well, because they're released in one sort of thing called Heroes for a New Hope. I'll be doing them at some point later down the line, maybe next week, I don't know. I'll figure it out. But essentially, this was one of the very first comics that was released in the new canon. I think the other ones were basically the first run of Darth Vader comics, the first run of Star Wars comics, and the first of the Canon comics, which is to do with the character Kanan Jarrus from Rebels. Now delving into the actual story and content within itself, this run of comics is set literally within minutes of the end of Return of the Jedi. It actually opens with essentially the Death Star 2 assault at the Battle of Endor, and it runs until basically 3 months after Return of the Jedi, thereabouts, which is 4 ABY to 5 ABY, assuming because the Battle of Endor was towards the end of the year. So I'm going to delve into some plot details now. There will be spoilers for the Shattered Empire comic, because obviously I'm going to be talking about it. I'm not going to, read it verbatim, because that's pointless, but I'm going to give some sort of footnotes and things, but it is going to basically say what happens in it. So, if you do really want to read the Shattered Empire comic, may not be worth listening to this, but although I would say that if you listen to this and then go back to it, it will kind of highlight some of the more interesting things that at least I found in the comic. So as I said a little bit earlier, it starts literally as the Battle of Endor is happening. One of the first comic panels is actually Vader and Luke locked in lightsabers. And essentially, it introduces Poe Dameron's parents, obviously Poe being from the sequel trilogy. His parents are called Shara Bay, who's his mum, and Kez Dameron, who's the dad. And Kez was actually in the bunker with Han on Endor, when he broke in and it was meant to be a trap and then the Ewoks came in and all, everyone was saved essentially. That's a part of a group called the Pathfinders, which is the name of Han's elite team on Endor, as I've explained. Shara Bay was actually flying an A-Wing, and she actually was in the battle above Endor and things. And in the first issue, it's more so just kind of concluding Return of the Jedi with a bit of extra information. When Luke and Darth Vader, or rather the corpse of Vader, left the Death Star 2 before it blew up, and obviously they were in an Imperial shuttle, Shara Bay, Poe's mum, she, in her A-Wing, saw it, basically was like, oh my god, there's an Imperial, let's shoot it down. And then Luke was like, oh no, wait, please, help, essentially, is not who you think it is, and then she helped escort them down. I only wanted to bring this up because it's just quite interesting, because a lot of the time you see in these films where someone takes over an Imperial or an enemy, in air quotes, ship or something like that, they commandeer it, and then everyone just kind of seemingly doesn't shoot them. So I quite liked the fact that they actually, even though it was only one panel, they actually had a dialogue essentially explaining that they were going to be shot down, which has been a very interesting end to Return of the Jedi, if Luke then got shot down on the way back to Endor by one of his own people, but I digress. The rest of the comic is really people just kind of being happy about, defeating the Empire and that sort of thing, and then about halfway through, Han says, there's still some Imperials left, they don't believe they've lost the war, so we need to basically go sort them out. There's a base on the other side of Endor, and they basically go and sort that out. The second issue is a bit more interesting. What shows up in that is actually one of those Palpatine droids that are red. If anyone has played the Star Wars Battlefront II game, the Shattered Empire comic goes along really, really well with that. So if anyone's going to read the Shattered Empire comic, I'd really recommend they go and either start playing or go back to Battlefront 2's campaign, because the events are very, very heavily linked, mainly due to Operation Cinder. Now, anyway, these red Palpatine droid things, essentially it's just a droid with like a screen for a face, and then they'll speak to you and they'll say, we have a message for you, we need a bit of your blood to prove it's you, and then it'll be a face of Palpatine shows up on the screen and gives someone an order. From what I can tell, these were pretty much all used for Operation Cinder, as they were in the Battlefront 2 game, and the time that you see it in the comic is mentioning Operation Cinder. Now, in brief, for anyone who is not aware, Operation Cinder was part of the contingency plan that Palpatine had after Return of the Jedi, basically in the event that he died. The Aftermath Trilogy goes into these into a lot more detail, although I don't think that the Aftermath Trilogy mentions Operation Cinder, but I could be wrong there. But essentially, the Aftermath Trilogy, which is an amazing trilogy, I really recommend it, by Chuck Wendig, it really helps kind of bridge the gap between episodes 6 and 7 in the way of what actually happened to the Empire, what happened directly after it, what happened at the Battle of Jakku, which is obviously in Force Awakens when you see Rey skirting around that Imperial Star Destroyer. It is from the Battle of Jakku. And I believe that's actually a Super Star Destroyer as well, which explains why it's so massively colossal. But essentially, the Aftermath Trilogy explains all of that sort of happened. So it's a really, really interesting thing that goes along really well with this. Anyway, back to Palpatine's droid and Operation Cinder. Operation Cinder was essentially Palpatine. He believes that his empire had failed, so he organised lots of these satellites to basically be deployed around these specific sets of planets, and they shoot basically these things to mess around with the planet's atmosphere, causing really bad electrical storms and some horrendous big sort of natural disasters like hurricanes and tsunamis and all these sort of things. And after doing it, it basically will make the planet inhabitable. Now, Palpatine, to what I can see online, Palpatine only really does this to 6 planets that we know of. He had plans to do another dozen of them, but those plans basically get cancelled, which I'll delve into in a minute. But one of the planets that he actually targeted, which is in the second comic, is Naboo. And Naboo is obviously very heavily in the prequel trilogy, because that's where Palpatine came from. And he demilitarized it and made sure that they were kind of, under his thumb, essentially. So when he died, basically, Naboo was one of the first places he attacked because he felt like they had failed him. And a lot of the planets that he went for were either ones that he knew were very much for the rebellion, but a lot of them, if not the majority, were actually ones that were Imperial strongholds. So he was basically trying to go around and destroy the Empire that failed him, so he could destroy it and all those sorts of things, and then basically lead it to bring on to the First Order and also the events of the end of Rise of Skywalker. So looping back to the second comic, essentially Shara Bey escorts Princess Leia on this mission to Naboo. They go there and essentially Operation Cinder starts to happen. Then the third issue starts. In the third issue, the Pathfinders, that group of hands form of elite team essentially, including Poe Dameron, they basically go to this Imperial base on the Wretch of Tehron. They attack it, they get these details, and they basically get C-3PO to hack in and take all the information regarding Operation Cinder. They get a list of all the planets that are on there. One of them is Naboo. And so towards the end of the third comic, Han and the Pathfinders and things basically go to Naboo. Now, before Han and stuff show up, essentially, Leia and Shara are there speaking to the now Queen of Naboo, and they basically say something starts to happen, and then they basically say, okay, we need to get some fighters and pilots and things. Naboo say we don't really have many of them at all, really. We don't have any fighters, we're quite a neutral planet. Palpatine demilitarized us, that sort of thing. So Leia, Shara, and the Queen of Naboo go up in starfighters, which was seen in episode 1. It's one of the ones that Anakin, or Little Annie, flies and blows up that separatist ship thing. They're basically the really, really yellowy ones that look quite sleek. They're the ones that I'm speaking of. They fly them up to basically try and take on the Empire and destroy the satellites. They look like they're about to lose, and then, as I said, the Pathfinders come back, basically defeat the Empire, and then Naboo is saved. The fourth comic, basically, it starts with them speaking about how the information that the Pathfinders got from the Imperial base, they basically are really helpful. They're going to go across the galaxy, they're going to try and save a lot of these planets that are going to be decimated, essentially, by Palpatine, and then Luke basically asks R2 to go find a pilot for him, and R2 finds Shara Bay, and so Shara and Luke go on this little adventure in the 4th issue. In the 4th issue, essentially, it's a really fun one. I can't tell if the 3rd or the 4th one's my favourite, but this is definitely a comic series that does get better as it goes, but it is really, really interesting, especially how it all sort of connects and things. And what they do, they go to this Imperial base, they try and sneak in, and they kind of get let in because there's one person who's in there who's like an expert, and he says him and Palpatine were the only ones who could study this weird thing they've got there that they are being elusive about, and it's a thing that Luke wants to travel to this Imperial base specifically to get. He lets them in, asks them what it is, and then it's like, trap, I knew you weren't this person. We're going to get you now that you've told us what these things are. Inside the Imperial Vault thing, essentially there's 2 bits of tree, and they don't look necessarily that special, but Luke says that these 2 parts of tree are from the big tree from the Jedi Temple in Coruscant. Now, if you haven't watched the Clone Wars series, you probably haven't seen it, because I don't think it's mentioned that much in other canon content. If you've read the Poe Dameron comics, it is in there a little bit, but I haven't read the Poe Dameron comics, so the extent of how much it is in my knowledge of is only limited. But essentially, the tree that was in the Jedi Temple was from Ahch-To, which is in the Last Jedi film. It's basically the tree thing that Luke keeps the ancient texts in, and then him and Yoda have a discussion about it. Then, he tries to set on fire, and then Yoda decides to shoot it with a lightning bolt. That tree itself is a Uneti tree, and the Uneti trees are from Ahch-To, and the tree in Coruscant, which was at the Jedi Temple, that was an Uneti tree as well. When Palpatine rose to power, he got rid of the tree, obviously kept a little bit of it for himself, and then he turned the Jedi Order temple into the Imperial base. Now, essentially, Luke and Shara managed to escape and things, because Luke is a whiz with a lightsaber and powerful in the Force and all that jazz. They escape with the trees, and then Luke basically keeps one, and to my knowledge, and what I could see online, we don't really know what he did with it. We don't think that it's the tree seen in Last Jedi, because the trees are from Ahch-To anyway, so I think that tree has been there for centuries and centuries and centuries. But Luke has done something with his other one, but he actually didn't realise there were going to be 2 parts of this tree, so he gave one to Shara Bay. Now, the trees, they're basically, they almost look like mini trees, so there's branches coming off, there's a bit of leaves and things, so you can plant them and they will grow. Shara Bay, at the end of the comic, takes it to her husband, Poe Dameron, and they plant it on Yavin 4, which is where the base was in A New Hope. So that is more or less everything that's to do with the Shattered Empire comic itself. I wanted to give a little bit more information about some of the other things within it. So one of the things I wanted to mention was Poe Dameron. Poe Dameron was actually born 2 ABY, 2 years after the Battle of Yavin, so 2 years after A New Hope. So that's actually 1 year before Empire Strikes Back, and around 2 years before Return of the Jedi. So at the time of this comic, Poe is only like a 1 or 2 year old baby, essentially. And they do mention him at one point. They say about, going home and seeing my boy, but you don't actually see him in these comics. Poe grew up on Yavin 4, which, as I said, is from A New Hope, where the rebel base was initially, that the Death Star was going to target and blow up if our plucky band of rebels hadn't blown up the first Death Star quick enough. And from what I can tell, after the Empire was defeated and things, between Return of the Jedi and Force Awakens, people lived on Yavin 4. There's quite a few people living on there, there's a lot of forests, all that sort of jazz. And basically that's where Shara planted the tree. They planted it in their backyard, essentially. As in the Poe Dameron comics, there is mention of Poe playing on the tree and things like that. So it's still surviving and thriving, and it's unknown really what happened to it from that point, at least from what I could see online. Now, I will say this is one of my favourite comic mini-series that I've read. It's not my absolute favourite. I think the Kylo Ren one's still probably that, and then maybe the Phasma comic. But I just think that I really like it when they tie in with the movies a lot more. I do like the individual comics that come out, such as Dr. Aphra. That's excellent, which I'll go into in another episode at some point. But I really like the ones that kind of tie in with the movies, especially ones which are specifically, Journey to the Blank, because they give a lot of added depth. And one of the biggest flaws in Star Wars, in my opinion, the movies at least, is that they want to go into loads and loads of depth. And you either have one of two things. You get things like the prequels, where you've just got loads of waffle that doesn't really seem to add anything necessarily. In Phantom Menace, there's so much talk that's all political. I haven't got a problem with it necessarily, but it's very, very heavy when other stuff could be in it. And then also they have these little plot holes and little bits that bits of information they miss out because the director or writers or whomever missed a bit of information. The film got released, and then it's like a lot of people notice all these plot holes. Now, what the comics and especially the books do really well is they tell other stories about normally other characters, but with the supporting characters being recognisable faces. Like in this one, it's mainly about the two Damerons, but the supporting cast is ironically Luke, Han and Leia. So in that regard, it just adds quite a lot to stories people already love. And if you're just getting into Star Wars, these are the comics that I really recommend people check out, the ones that are the Journey to ones, because then you can watch the films, you can read the comics, and it's more tacking on information that you already know, as opposed to just being like, here's loads of new information about all these new characters and all these new planets and creatures and all these sort of other crazy things that's going on. It's a lot easier, at least in my opinion, to retain information if it's connected to something you already know, rather than learning something completely new. In addition to this, what I will say is that I said before, I think that the Aftermath Trilogy is something I highly, highly recommend to any people trying to get into the wider Star Wars canon. It's what I finished recently. They are 3 books and they are quite chunky, but if you have Audible, they do have like audio drama versions of pretty much all the Star Wars books to my knowledge. They've got sound effects and all kinds of other crazy things. It's been described as almost listening to a movie, essentially. So I'd really recommend people check out the Aftermath Trilogy of books. I've also heard the book Lost Stars, which I mentioned earlier, by Claudia Gray, is really good to sort of read that goes along with these things. I haven't read Lost Stars. I've heard it's amazing. It's on my list, but there's so many things that I need to do, I can't read everything. So it's basically the, in air quotes, recommended for this is obviously to see the original trilogy in Force Awakens, but then to also read the Aftermath Trilogy, play Star Wars Battlefront II, the campaign, regardless of your opinion on EA and loot boxes and multiplayer and all these sort of other things. The campaign itself is fairly solid. It is a bit short. It's only about 6-ish, maybe 7 hours long. There is a bit of information that kind of goes further and goes more on towards the Resistance and the First Order, which I think is like the last 2 missions, 2 or 3 missions on the game. They released it as like extra DLC after the game came out for free. And if you can get the game cheap, which I think you might be able to now for like 15-20 quid, and you have no interest in playing online, I would recommend getting the game just because I really enjoyed the campaign. It's got a new character in it. It's got interesting perspectives, more so from the Empire side. So yeah, Battlefront 2, the campaign mode, the Aftermath Trilogy, and the Lost Stars book are all things I really recommend. And if you're thinking of buying the comics, I personally prefer to have the physical comics with me. I like having my nice little comic collection and be able to sift through all the Star Wars comics. I generally prefer physical content, but I'm not shying away necessarily from digital comics. If you are going to get this comic, obviously getting it digitally I think is quite a lot cheaper and quite a bit quicker. But if you are interested in having it physically, I would recommend people get the Shattered Empire hardcover edition, because it will include the C-3PO comic, which is quite hard to get by itself. So I'd really recommend that, because the C-3PO comic as well is something that goes really, really well with the Shattered Empire comic. Obviously, being included in the hardcover is the reason for that, and as I said earlier, connecting to the journey to The Force Awakens. But the C-3PO comic, Shattered Empire, Aftermath Trilogy, Lost Stars, Battlefront 2, they're the things that you should read if you want to get a bit more information on essentially what happened after Return of the Jedi, more information on Operation Cinder, and Palpatine's contingency, as it were. And that's more or less it for me, guys. I do try and keep these episodes short-ish, a little bit less rambling, a bit more just kind of what information that I find is interesting from the comics themselves, as well as little tidbits of information I like to give that kind of connect the dots without me just sitting here and going, here's Poe Dameron's life story, here's everything that happened to Shara, it's that sort of thing. So I haven't fully decided what I'm going to do next week. I have got the Heroes for a New Hope hardcover comic that I got recently, which is, there's 3 miniseries released. Well, actually, there are 4 miniseries released. One of Han, one of Leia, one of Lando, one of Chewie. The Lando, Chewie, and Leia ones are all in this thing, Heroes for a New Hope. The Han Solo one I had to buy separately. But I've got those 4, which I have not yet read. I'm going to delve into those shortly. I think I may do the Captain Phasma comic next week, because that actually gives some really interesting insight from what happened to her between The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, because obviously last thing you heard about her was Han and Finn were like, hey, what should we do with this after she loaded the shields of the Starkiller base? I'll put her in the garbage disposal, garbage chute, obviously giving a reference to The New Hope. So I think that might be where I start, because I have read that comic already, so I know quite a few things about that. So unless my mind changes in the next week, it's probably going to be the Captain Phasma comic, actually, and then I'll kind of go from there. But any of you guys that are listening, if you really want me to tackle a specific set of comics, a story, or anything in particular you want me to chat about, you are more than welcome to send me an email at starwarscomicsincanon@outlook.com, or find me on social media at Genuine Chit-Chat on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. And yeah, I also think that down the line I may do the odd one about books. I am at the moment reading the Bloodline book, which is another one which it's not a journey to The Force Awakens, but I think it's released after The Force Awakens, and it gives some insight sort of 10 or so years after the events of this comic. I'm thinking about, on the odd occasion, doing a Star Wars Comics in Canon episode about the books. I really want to tackle the Aftermath Trilogy. It's going to be quite hefty because there's like 3 books and they're like 400 to 500 pages each. So I was probably just going to do one episode kind of lightly talking about the 3 of them, which I may also do next week. Who knows? Maybe I'll do the Phasma one, then the Aftermath one. At the moment, I'm kind of on the fence and things. If anyone listening has a specific preference, just send me an email. And if I do get one that leans more on one than the other, I'll probably choose that. Otherwise, who knows? It can be an adventure. Anyway, guys, thank you as always for listening. I appreciate you listening, especially my little ramble at the end there. And make sure you check out the other shows on the Comics Emotions feed. And if you want to find my podcast, Genuine Chit-Chat, I have honest conversations with interesting people, which is the tagline. And I speak to relatively someone different every episode. I've had the guys from Comics Emotion on. I've had Tony from the Indie Comic Spotlight on as well. I am planning on having Max on at some point too. So I've had those guys on, but I've also had other people, filmmakers, authors, musicians, people from all kind of walks of life. So if you quite like the interview style podcasts, but you like them where they're uncensored, they're informal, more of a conversation than an interview, that's sort of what Genuine Chit-Chat's all about. So if you want to check that out, as I said, Genuine Chit-Chat in all the usual social media places. I really appreciate you guys listening to this, and may the Force be with you.